I'm representing a radial basis function kernel, a common kernel type in machine learning used to measure similarity based on the distance between data points. Think of it as measuring how close two data points are in a high-dimensional space. This plus sign means I'm adding another kernel to the RBF kernel. We're combining kernels to improve the model's flexibility. I represent a linear kernel. Unlike the RBF kernel, I measure similarity based on the linear relationship between data points. Think of it as drawing a straight line to find the relationship between the points. Hey again, I'm another RBF kernel. See, you can add multiple kernels in this way. This question asks you to identify the correct ways to combine a radial basis function, RBF, kernel and a linear kernel using the SUM kernel in scikit-learn's Gaussian process regression. It's testing your understanding of how to create and combine kernels. I can combine the RBF and linear kernels using the plus sign. This directly adds both kernels together, using default settings for each. It's a simple and straightforward way to do it. This is another correct method. Here, I explicitly use the SUM kernel class to combine the RBF and linear kernels. This is a clear and efficient approach, making the code easily readable. This is also perfectly fine. Notice, I'm scaling the linear kernel by multiplying it with 1.0. I can also scale RBF or even both before combining them. The plus sign combines them. This option does the same thing as D, but it scales the RBF kernel by 1.0 before adding the linear kernel. Both methods are entirely valid. This section introduces the core problem, combining different kernel functions in scikit-learn's Gaussian process regression. I'm focusing on combining a radial basis function, RBF, kernel and a linear kernel using the SUM kernel. This involves understanding how to use the scikit-learn kernel API. This is the quiz question. I'm presented with 4 different ways to combine an RBF kernel and a linear kernel in scikit-learn, and I need to identify all the correct options. This option shows one way to combine kernels. I multiply the RBF kernel by 1.0, a hyperparameter, and then add it to the linear kernel. The plus acts as the SUM kernel here. This is another way of combining kernels. I add the RBF kernel and linear kernel directly, without explicit scaling. Scikit-learn handles this as a sum of kernels. This is the most explicit way to combine kernels, using the SUM class directly. I'm creating a SUM kernel object with RBF and linear kernel as inputs. This is generally considered best practice for clarity. This is similar to option A, but here, I scale the linear kernel by 1.0 before adding it to the RBF kernel. This is another valid way to achieve the desired combination. This confirms all options, A, B, C, and D, are correct ways to combine the RBF and linear kernels using the SUM kernel in scikit-learn. Awesome! This section introduces the core problem. SCIKITLEARN, Gaussian process regression uses kernels to model data. I'm combining kernels to build a more powerful model. This involves understanding how to add them together. This is the central question. I want to find the correct code to sum an RBF kernel, radial basis function, a common kernel type, and a linear kernel. The SUM kernel is just like it sounds. It adds the outputs of the individual kernels. This code works. I'm scaling the RBF kernel by 1.0, which doesn't change its value, and then adding the linear kernel to it. The plus sign, plus, performs the addition. This is a shorter version of option A. I'm directly adding the kernels without any scaling. It still works perfectly. This is the most explicit way. I'm using the SUM class directly to combine the kernels. This makes the code very easy to understand. Similar to A, this code works. I'm scaling the linear kernel this time and adding it to the RBF kernel. I see this option as adding an RBF kernel and a linear kernel directly. It's a simple and intuitive way to combine them, using the plus sign to represent kernel addition. The kernels are added together, element-wise. It's like adding 2 functions together. You get a new function that's the sum of the 2 original ones. Pretty neat, huh? This option shows me that the "sum" class explicitly combines the RBF and linear kernels. Think of it as a more formal way to specify kernel addition, providing improved readability and clarity in code. RBF stands for radial basis function. The sum kernel explicitly constructs the sum of the outputs of the given kernel functions. It's the most explicit approach and often preferred for better code organization. I see a hyperparameter, 1.0, scaling the RBF kernel before adding the linear kernel. It's similar to option B, but now we're adjusting the influence of the RBF kernel before combining them using the plus operator. This allows for more fine-tuned control over the contribution of each kernel. Similar to option A, this option scales the linear kernel using a hyperparameter, 1.0, before the addition with the RBF kernel. This gives the same flexibility of adjusting the contribution of each kernel as in option A, but by adjusting the linear kernel. You could interpret this as emphasizing the linear kernel's influence more than the RBF kernel. It really highlights how flexible this approach is. This question asks you to identify the correct way to combine a radial basis function, RBF, kernel and a linear kernel in scikit-learn's Gaussian process regression using the sum kernel. It's a multiple-choice question testing your understanding of kernel combinations. This option explicitly uses the SUM kernel class to combine the RBF and linear kernels. I find this the clearest and most readable approach. I directly tell scikit-learn to create a sum kernel using those two. Here, I combine the kernels using the plus sign. The 1.0 scales the linear kernel before the addition. It's another perfectly valid way to do it. It's a bit more implicit, relying on the plus operator's overloaded behavior for kernels. This option uses the plus sign to add the kernels. The 1.0 scales the RBF kernel before adding the linear kernel. I like how explicit the scaling is here. This is a short form for radial basis function kernel, a common kernel type in machine learning. It's a function that measures similarity based on the distance between data points. The sum kernel combines other kernels by adding their outputs. Think of it like adding two functions together. The result is a new function. The plus sign here indicates the addition of two kernels. In scikit-learn, this operator is overloaded to perform kernel addition. This kernel measures similarity using the dot product of data points. It's simple but can be powerful in certain applications. The plus sign here represents the kernel addition, combining the RBF and linear kernels. This sets up the core problem: finding the correct way to combine kernels in Gaussian process regression using the sum kernel in scikit-learn.